Hi, everyone. Welcome to Pulse Canada's webinar, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Janelle Kersell, and I'm the Senior Manager of Food Innovation and Marketing here at Pulse Canada. For those who aren't familiar, our organization represents the Canadian pulse industry, and a major focus of our team is working with ingredient processors and food manufacturers in order to support the development and success of products containing peas, beans, chickpeas, and lentils. Before I begin, I have a few housekeeping items to note. We will be taking time at the end of the presentation to answer a few questions. You can use the Q&A box to type in your question at any time throughout the presentation. If you're joining on a mobile device, you'll find the Q&A box by tapping on the question mark icon. We will be sharing a recording of the presentation with all those who registered later this week. Today we're joined by Pulse Canada's Chris Marinangeli, who's going to discuss making protein claims for plant-based food products. Chris completed an interdisciplinary doctorate in nutrition and food science at the University of Manitoba's Richardson Centre for Functional Foods and Nutraceuticals. Following his tenure as Senior Manager of Nutrition Science and Regulatory Affairs at Kellogg's Canada, he joined Pulse Canada as Director of Nutrition Science and Regulatory Affairs. Chris serves on the Scientific Review Committee and Board of Directors for the Canadian Federation of Dietetic Research and previously served on the Canadian Advisory Council for the International Life Sciences Institute of North America. So with that, I'd like to pass the floor to Chris.
Thank you, Janelle, for the kind introduction, and welcome to everybody on the phone today to listen to this presentation. I think the topic of today's presentation is quite timely given the climate that we're in terms of the focus internationally that we're having on increasing consumption of plant-based protein, and the regulations in North America can be quite difficult to navigate if you are familiar with them in terms of making protein claims on plant-based protein foods. But before I jump into that portion of the presentation, I am going to give some context and some background around plant-based protein and the adoption of healthy and sustainable dietary patterns, and then jump into focusing on regulatory frameworks for labeling foods in North America as a source of protein, then discuss the ongoing challenges with North America's protein labeling regulations as they particularly pertain to plant-based foods, and then finish off today's presentation discussing some ideas around regulatory modernization for protein nutrient content claims. This section of the presentation will primarily focus on Canada because this is where our work has been primarily focused to date. But it should give you an idea of perhaps some directions where we could go in terms of regulations for protein claims moving forward. So to start things off, let's bring some context to the discussion today around plant-based protein and the adoption of healthy dietary patterns. And when we talk about healthy dietary patterns and the utilization of plant-based proteins, often we're talking about pulses and legumes and nuts and seeds. And this is data from a meta-analysis which demonstrates, generally speaking, when you look at these components and their contributions to healthy dietary patterns, increased consumption of plant-based sources of protein such as pulses and nuts, as seen as in this table here, can over time facilitate better blood glucose management, seen here with a reduction in glycated hemoglobin A1C, reduction in cardiovascular disease risk, and then specific reduction in risk factors for chronic disease such as body weight, LDL cholesterol, and blood pressure with legumes, as well as triglyceride lowering with consumption of nuts. And then in the context of healthy dietary patterns that we promote internationally as part of healthy eating, such as the Mediterranean diet, the Nordic diet, or the portfolio diet, or the dietary approaches to stop hypertension diet, these types of foods are all integrated into these types of dietary patterns, demonstrating that the effects of these dietary patterns also show reduction in better blood glucose management and reduction in cardiovascular disease risk, as well as specific risk factors such as cholesterol, body weight, and blood pressure, and so on and so forth. But the conversation has gotten a lot more complex over the last few years because dietary patterns are not only promoted in terms of health, but they're also beginning to consider other things like climate change and environmental sustainability. And this is a fairly old graphic now, but the concept being that when we talk about protein, The idea being that if we, in some cases, perhaps in our dietary patterns, over-index in one type of source of protein, those from animal origin, we could be over-indexing on the consumption of dietary factors that increase risk for chronic disease, but also um, um, promoting or creating a pull for an agricultural system, which perhaps has can have an effect on climate change. So the idea being, if we can recalibrate dietary patterns to include more plant-based proteins, we can not only increase the nutrient density of diets and reduce risk of chronic disease, but also improve the sustainability footprint of agricultural systems. And this is some data out of the UK that modeled not only health, but environmental sustainability of various dietary patterns from data from over 150 countries. And if you look at the bottom of the graph here, you have um, the first 8 bars are probably reductionist views of dietary patterns, where you're just removing animal protein from the diet and looking at the effects on reduction of premature mortality on the x-axis. But a more encompassing approach on the right-hand side, where you're looking at dietary patterns here, and you can see that it's not really a one-size-fits-all. There are different there are different ways in which you can incorporate plant-based protein in dietary patterns and still get substantial effects on the reduction of premature mortality. And here they looked at flexitarian diets all the way to vegan type diets. And it's not just obviously dependent on plant-based protein, but also facilitating an increase in fruit and vegetable intake. And the same can be said when we look at domains of environmental sustainability, looking at, instead of a reductionist approach by just removing one specific dietary constituent like animal protein or calories, looking at a dietary pattern approach, as you can see on the right-hand side of the screen, you get better reductions in all domains of environmental sustainability. And we're seeing these concepts integrate themselves into food-based dietary guidelines and policy. So this is fairly old at this point now, but the 2015 Dutch-based food dietary guidelines, where they gave a brief description of various dietary components that they'd like their citizens to consume more of. They did have a section on legumes, for example, that discussed the effects of legume consumption, including pulses on cardiometabolic risk, but also more broadly, did acknowledge that complying to a number of guidelines would not only result in health gain, but also a lower ecological burden. The Nordic guidelines from 2012 had a whole section on environmental sustainability, where plant-based proteins were categorized in the section of foods that have the lowest carbon footprint. And I would be remiss if I didn't talk about Canada's most recent iteration of their dietary guidelines, recently published in 2019, where in putting together these dietary guidelines, they did a systematic review of the literature, looking at dietary patterns and the effects of dietary patterns on chronic disease risk factors and cardiometabolic risk, looking at things like the Mediterranean diet, for example. So when they came out with the healthy dietary habits, one of them was eat plenty of vegetables and fruit, whole grains and protein foods, choose protein foods that come from plants more often. And then we look back, and when they were putting together, getting ready for the release of the dietary guidelines in Canada, and they published some of the guiding elements that they were considering when putting together this document, they did acknowledge the environment, where they indicated that there are benefits of shifting toward there are benefits towards consuming diets higher in plant-based foods and lower in animal-based foods, because they're associated with lower environmental impact. And we're seeing this manifest itself in the marketplace. So, for example, protein has been a primary driver of food innovation over the last 10 years or so. We've seen an influx of protein foods entering the market. Consumers have developed an affinity for protein and their own belief systems around protein and the health benefits of high protein diets. And then on the tail end of that, in the last few years, we've seen another emerging trend with the introduction of the consumer looking for plant-based foods. And together, this creates more or less a macro trend where I think as an industry we can leverage the fact that pulses and other foods are high in plant-based protein, and one could argue now is the time to harness this idea of consuming diets that consider both nutrition and environmental sustainability. And really what it is about and what dietary guidelines are trying to do, and I think what health professionals are trying to do, is change the value proposition of the consumer, where they consider where they value high quality and sustainable foods, not only from a nutritional perspective with respect to reduction of chronic disease and addressing poor dietary habits, but also the effects of dietary patterns on global warming and some of the future challenges around food production. This is the most recent data from the 2020 Food and Health Survey from the International Food Information Council. And this was a question around perceived healthfulness of foods. And just to note that protein from plant sources were only a third to fiber and whole grains, where just under or just at 70% of those individuals surveyed indicated that they perceive plant sources of protein as healthy. And when they asked the question around their consumption patterns over the last 12 months, 28% of individuals indicated that today, over the last 12 months, they eat much more or somewhat more protein from plant sources compared to 11% of individuals who consume much less or somewhat less now. So how do you transition this trend to an opportunity? Plant-based sources of protein have been around for as long as I can remember. They're certainly not new to the marketplace, but I think industry is definitely using them and promoting them more, and perhaps touting those health benefits a lot more within the marketplace and on food products. And we're seeing that in dietary guidelines. So how do we transition this trend to an opportunity? Well, I think number one is we want to be able to talk about these foods within the marketplace. And the lowest hanging fruit in terms of talking about these foods is really claiming that foods are a source of protein or a source of plant-based protein. And this falls under what we call a nutrient content claim, which is probably the lowest tier claim that you can use on a food. And most jurisdictions have criteria within their regulations around nutrient content claims and what the cutoffs are for nutrients, including protein, to make those claims on food products. In Canada and the US is not much different. And that is actually a really good launching point to move into the next section of today's presentation, talking about the regulatory frameworks for labeling foods as a source of protein in Canada and the US. So one thing to consider in North America, particularly Canada and the US, is that when we talk about protein claims on food and nutrient content claims on food, it is a little bit different than other nutrient content claims, as if you're talking about vitamin C or fiber. And that it's not just about the amount of protein in the food per serving or per reference amount. It's also about the quality of the protein within the food. It's contingent on those two domains. It's also worthwhile to note that when we talk about nutrient content claims and labeling, we're extrapolating that also to the advertising of food. So generally, these labeling guidelines and these labeling regulations are not just about what's on pack. It does extend to the promotion of these foods across different media platforms. But before I jump into the regulatory framework, I think it's important to get everybody on the same page in terms of protein quality and what we're referring to. So generally speaking, when we talk about protein quality, we're talking about two things. We're talking about the ability for protein to provide amino acids, and we're talking about the ability for those proteins to be digested and assimilated in humans. So proteins are comprised of amino acids, and there are two categories of amino acids in proteins. There's the indispensable amino acids, which are essential, which are on the left-hand side of the table, and the dispensable amino acids, which are non-essential, which are on the right-hand side of the table. And it's important to note that indispensable amino acids are essential, which means we cannot manufacture these amino acids in the body, and we need to attain these amino acids from the diet. So if we go back to animal protein foods, which are generally high in protein, more generally, they contain all of the indispensable amino acids at fairly high levels. And the digestibility of these foods are fairly high. So our ability to digest and assimilate and absorb these amino acids for metabolic work is quite high, generally across the board. When we, sorry, when we talk about plant-based foods, we can have plant-based protein sources like pulses and nuts and seeds that have high levels of protein. But generally speaking, plant-based sources of protein are lower in one or more of the indispensable amino acids. And the digestibility of these foods can be moderate to fairly high, and in some cases, very similar to what we see in animal sources of protein. But that variability, or that characteristics where the plant-based sources of protein are lower in one or more indispensable amino acids, I don't want to say it can be problematic, but it is something to be cognizant of. And that's why we introduced the concept of complementary proteins to increase the protein quality of these foods. So the idea being, as you mix different protein sources together to make up for shortfalls in indispensable amino acids so that you can increase the protein quality of these foods. And one of the best examples of this is pulses and cereals. So pulses traditionally are lower in sulfur amino acids and sometimes tryptophan, but higher in lysine, whereas cereals are lower in lysine and higher in sulfur amino acids. So they're complementary to each other. So when you mix them together in the context of a manufactured food, or consume different types of protein sources throughout the day, you do get that complementarity of protein, and you're able to achieve your indispensable amino acid requirements. To make things even more complex, and we move back to the regulatory frameworks that are in place in North America, while both Canada and the US do rely on protein quality to support protein nutrient content claims, they rely on different systems and methods to assess protein quality. So in Canada, we rely on the protein rating system, which is derived from an adjusted protein efficiency ratio and the grams of protein in a product or a food per reasonable daily intake. This is a rat bioassay, and I'm going to get into the details further in my presentation, but I'm just going to give you a quick overview here. It's a rat growth bioassay where, in essence, you feed rats your test protein compared to a high quality control protein and determine the growth trajectory of the rat per gram of protein intake. So once you have that protein efficiency ratio, you multiply that by the grams of protein per reasonable daily intake of the food, you get a protein rating, and it allows you to qualify the food as either a good source of protein or an excellent source of protein. In the US, the system is a little bit different. They use what's called the protein digestibility corrected amino acid score, which was brought in 1991 in a report from the FAO to replace the PER as a more accurate depiction of protein quality in humans. And it essentially generates a correction factor for protein quality. So you generate a PDCAS of a food, which is a correction factor. You multiply that by the level of protein per gram per reference amount customarily consumed, which is a regulated serving of food in the US. From that, you get a corrected protein level per serving, and you determine that level relative to the daily value of protein in the States, which is 50 grams. And from there, you're able to determine whether or not you meet the thresholds for a good or excellent source of protein. So just an example, if I have 100 grams of protein and the PDCAS of that protein is 0.8 or 80%, that means of that 100 grams of protein, essentially, I have 80 grams of quality protein. That's essentially what the PDCAS is doing for you. So we jump into the core method here just to show you what it looks like conceptually. Here is a depiction of how you would determine the PER of a food within the Canadian system. So and this is the method outlined by Health Canada back in 1981. This is the method that is outlined in the Canadian regulations to determine the PER of a food. So in essence, you start with 20 rats, 10 of them are assigned to each group. You have a control group and a test group. The control group is fed a high quality control protein, which is casein. In the test group, you have your test protein as a proportion of the diet. After 4 weeks, within each group, you assess the weight gain per gram protein consumed. You take the ratio of those two the ratio of those two ratios, the ratios of the ratios, and then you get a PER. And then to adjust for intra-laboratory differences, you multiply that PER by 2.5, which is a correction factor, and that gives you the PER of the food, and then you can go on to determine the protein rating by looking at the reasonable daily intake of that food, the protein in a reasonable daily intake of that food. It is important to note that at the Government of Canada, the Canadian Food Inspection Agency has published the protein efficiency ratios of about 47 foods on their website. So that is available. These are generally staple foods, but these protein efficiency ratios are available for utilization. And just as what I touched upon earlier, as predicted, as you move from animal-based protein to plant-based sources of protein, you generally do get a reduction in protein efficiency ratios. Now, you might ask yourself, well, what if a food doesn't have a reasonable daily intake? Well, you can easily check. If you go to the Canadian Food and Drug Regulations under Schedule K within the regulations, that is the list of reasonable daily intakes for various foods within our Food and Drug Regulation. It is not a very long list or exhaustive list, and it has been acknowledged that given today's landscape where a lot more protein foods are consumed, I would say, a reasonable daily intake is not available for all of the foods available. And in that case, the Canadian Food Inspection Agency has provided some guidance that if no RDI or reasonable daily intake is specified, then the reference amount for that food can be used. And a reference amount in Canada is a regulated serving size of food. And there is a Government of Canada website which lists reference amounts for different foods, and the list is a lot more comprehensive than what we have for the reasonable daily intakes. So with that, I'm going to briefly transition now to calculating the protein digestibility corrected amino acid score, which is the system utilized in the US and outlined in the US regulatory framework for protein content claims. So it's a little bit different. There is a bioassay affiliated with this methodology. It is to determine the digestibility value of the protein in question to calculate PDCAS. But generally speaking, if you have all of the information required, you can calculate this on a piece of paper if you have all the information. So the information required to calculate the PDCAS of a food is the indispensable amino acid composition of the food or the ingredients in the food. So remember there was 9 amino acids that are indispensable. You would need to know the level of each of those amino acids within your food, and the protein sources. If you have a mixed food, the indispensable amino acids of all of the protein sources for that mixed food. You need to know the indispensable amino acid requirements of a reference population. In the US, the reference population that is used is for 2 to 5-year-old children. That is outlined by the FAO and the WHO in their 1991 report, which is available online. The reason for using children as the reference population for indispensable amino acid recommendations is that children's amino acid or indispensable amino acid recommendations are generally a little bit higher, so it safeguards more broadly against I guess deficiencies or shortfalls in amino acid intakes, indispensable amino acid intakes, as we're calculating PDCAS. You need to know the true nitrogen digestibility of the proteins used within the formulation, and that's where this rat bioassay comes into play. And you need to know that the daily value of a protein in the US is 50 grams, and that's where we calculate the percent DV of the protein relative to that DV from the corrected protein level. So this looks a bit overwhelming, and it's not as bad as it looks, but this just gives you a walkthrough on how to calculate PDCAS for a food. So on the left-hand side of the screen here, you have your food, and we're going to pretend that it's made up of 2 different protein sources, and we know the protein content of each of these protein sources, and we know the indispensable amino acid composition of each of these 2 protein sources. In addition, we also know the true fecal nitrogen digestibility of the 2 protein sources, and this allows us to calculate the weighted digestibility. We would consider the proportion of each of these protein sources within the food. And we also have that reference population, the 2 to 5-year-old children, to make the calculation. So for each indispensable amino acid, what we do is we sum, for each individual amino acid, we take the sum within the food and we divide it by the amino acid recommended intake from the reference pattern. So for lysine, for example, we sum up all the lysine within the food and we divide that by the lysine recommendation from the reference population. And we do that for every indispensable amino acid. And that gives us an amino acid score for each indispensable amino acid. We take the amino acid with the lowest score and we multiply that by the weighted average true digestibility. And that gives us the PDCAS of the food, because it's really contingent on the lowest score, because the lowest score is the limiting amino acid within the food. And from there, it's fairly straightforward. To get the corrected protein level in the food, we multiply the correction factor, which is the PDCAS, by the level of protein and a reference amount customarily consumed, which is the regulated serving size. That gives us the corrected protein, and we just divide that by 50 grams, the DV. So from there, I think I'm going to transition now to discuss some of the ongoing challenges with the North America's protein labeling regulations as they pertain to protein foods, and just some things that you should be cognitive as perhaps you're formulating foods for the North American market that are contingent on protein. So very, very quickly and easily, if we take a look at the Canadian system and apply it to plant-based protein sources like pulses, full disclosure, I work for Pulse Canada, and we have all of the adjusted PERs here, and we have the reasonable daily intake, which there exists a reasonable daily intake for beans, but there is no reasonable daily intake for other pulses. So we're going to use the reference amount, which is a half a cup of pulses. And we calculate the protein rating using this information. And when we determine whether or not pulses in Canada are eligible to make a protein claim, it's actually quite surprising that beans and no other pulses generally can make a protein claim within Canada. That's likely given to the fact that not only we're using the PER system, but also the fact that when we have to use the reference amount, it's fairly low compared to the reasonable daily intake. So with that, there are a number of challenges just fundamentally with using this system within the Canadian regulatory framework. The first challenge is obviously there aren't a lot of PER values available for industry stakeholders to use. Not many, if Canada might be the only developed jurisdiction using PER for non-infant foods to determine the protein quality of foods destined for the general marketplace. So PERs for novel food ingredients are generally not being produced by ingredient companies or I guess agricultural associations for their commodities. PER values are not additive. So it's very difficult if I'm formulating a food and I'm mixing various protein sources together. It's not a matter of just weighting the proportion of each protein source and coming up with a PER value. Generally speaking, for new foods, ingredients, or new multi-component foods, you would need to conduct a PER study, a rat bioassay study, which essentially slows innovation and essentially over time, because in many cases you might not be able to get these products on the market with the communication platform that you're looking for, can reduce the consumption of plant-based protein sources to consumers. This is quite different from PDCAS, where if you do have all of the information available, you can calculate and predict the PDCAS value of your multi-component food. And I've actually done this here. So on the right, on the y-axis here, I have the PDCAS score, and my base food is almonds, which is has a fairly low PDCAS. And you can see here, I know the indispensable amino acid levels of all of these different pulses. I know the digestibility value of all these different pulses, and I'm able to conduct a staggered PDCAS score as I start increasing the utilization of all of these pulses as an addition to the almonds. And you can see the protein quality, or the PDCAS score, increases as you start making up for shortfalls in indispensable amino acid levels. So the PDCAS, with PDCAS, PDCAS values can be additive, and you can calculate theoretically the PDCAS of a given food. It's important to note, just to highlight again, that this is a rat bioassay, that the PR method does not really reflect the amino acid requirements of humans. The amino acid requirements of the rat are different from humans. And because it's a rat growth bioassay, it doesn't really credit the amino acid requirements for maintenance. And it is also important to note that industry generally, in many cases, is moving away from animal testing, which makes it that much harder to use this methodology to underpin quality or protein messages on foods. And lastly, on the slide, I've really focused on PER and the actual methodology itself. But to generate the protein rating, it's contingent on the use of reasonable daily intakes as identified by the Government of Canada. But the reasonable daily intake could inflate the protein value of that food within a given dietary pattern. And a good example of that is bread. So in Canada, the reasonable daily intake for bread is 5 slices, but the reference amount or the serving size is about 2 slices. So when I'm calculating the protein quality of bread, it's based on the assumption that someone is going to consume 5 slices per day, when in actual fact, they might only be consuming 2. So that's just something to be cognizant of moving forward. Now, I'm not giving this presentation to come down on the Government of Canada for the regulations that we have. The regulations are in place given the food landscape that we had when the regulations were developed, and I think it'd be difficult to predict the situation that we're in now, where plant-based protein is emphasized more and more as underpinning some of the health benefits of foods within the marketplace. And the Government of Canada has acknowledged that the current regulatory system is prohibitive for some industry stakeholders from formulating foods that are going to be underpinned by protein content, especially in the plant-based space. So they have offered some temporary solutions. And if you go to the Canadian Food Inspection Agency's website, these solutions are actually documented in their guidance for industry labeling within that document. And the primary tool that is available is converting PDCAS values to PER. So in essence, if you know the PDCAS of your food, multiply the PDCAS by 2.5, which was that correction factor. And some, I guess, modeling analysis that they had done internally demonstrated it does give PER values that likely would align if you were going to do the actual PER study. So from there, you're essentially using a PDCAS to generate a PER, and then you move forward with the general methodology for making protein claims within the Canadian marketplace. It is important to note that this method has not been validated, and it does not address fundamental concerns with the PER method, and that if something seems awry within the marketplace, you could be subjected to enforcement and asked to generate a true PER using a rat bioassay. But this tool, again, is available by way of the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, as the Government of Canada has acknowledged that the current framework is a challenge for industry. But those challenges don't only exist in Canada. And in fact, if we take a look at the US system and apply the labeling regulations to pulses, for example, in the US, many different types of pulses that are promoted in dietary guidelines for Americans are also not able to make or meet the thresholds for protein claims. And that's likely due to the fact, again, not only from lower PDCAS values, obviously, but the reference amount for pulses in the States comes in at about 90 grams, except for beans or baked beans, which comes in at around 130 grams. So that's a contributing factor and an ongoing challenge. A few years ago at Pulse Canada, we did an assessment globally of the typical serving size of pulses that individuals are consuming within different populations and across regions. And what we found was typically 100 grams or a half a cup of pulses is the general serving size being promoted across dietary guidelines. And just to note, if we were going to take 100 grams of pulses or half a cup of black beans and chickpeas, which contains about 8 to 9 grams of protein, and apply the regulatory frameworks within Canada, in neither instances would one be able to make a protein claim on just pulses as they're emphasized in dietary guidelines, which is different from what we see in the EU and Australia and New Zealand. And I'll talk about this a little bit later. And their regulatory frameworks are a little bit different. And with that, I'm going to transition now to how do we move forward with regulatory modernization, a Canadian perspective. And this section of the presentation isn't meant to give guidance to the Government of Canada in any way, but it's really what we've been doing over the last few years at Pulse Canada is generating the conversation and highlighting the challenges and some of the disconnects between nutritional policy and what stakeholders are able to do on the ground to get consumers to adopt the dietary patterns that are being promoted. And we've done this publicly with various partners and experts across the academic spectrum, both nationally in Canada at the University of Toronto and the University of Manitoba, but also with collaborators across the globe in Europe and Italy. So some of the suggestions that have been floated within the literature and the conversations that we've been having, it would be perhaps in Canada we adopt PDCAS, which seems like an obvious choice. Many of the labeling regulations or some of the most recent regulations that have changed in Canada with respect to food labeling have been harmonized between our two countries. We do share DRIs, for example, dietary reference intakes, and it would be the obvious first step forward, I think, given that we do share many aspects of our food systems, and many of the foods available in Canada are available in the US and vice versa. But within this manuscript that we published a few years ago now, we did put pen to paper in terms of some suggestions, and some of the suggestions we had for adopting PDCAS in Canada aligned completely with the US system, but we also put in, I guess, some recommendations to ensure that the regulatory system in Canada, if quality was to remain in place, was agile enough to adapt to a changing food landscape in the future. Which brings me to suggestion number 2, which could be the removal of protein quality as criteria for protein nutrient content claims, which might seem a little bit extreme. But when we look at other jurisdictions around the world, like Australia and New Zealand and Europe, even standards from Codex, which seem to have been largely adopted by China and South Korea, the cutoffs and the thresholds for making protein claims in these jurisdictions seem to be contingent more so on the absolute level of protein per serving of food, or the contribution of energy per serving of food, rather than protein quality. And as far as I know, there is no evidence to suggest that these regulatory frameworks are facilitating detriments in protein intakes within these jurisdictions, even when plant-based protein is a diet that's higher in plant-based protein is adopted by the population. And then finally, you can't get away from the fact that there could be a hybrid approach where perhaps for some foods there's a quality assessment, and maybe for some of the staple foods there isn't. And that's just something that's been put forward as a possible option. By no means is anyone married to these. This is just conversation starters at this point. From some of the conversations that we've had, and some of the information that Health Canada has disclosed publicly in public forums, modernization of the protein labeling regulations in Canada is on the agenda in the near future. So with that, key takeaways from my presentation are that increasing the proportion of plant protein in diets underpins many initiatives to decrease risk of chronic disease and improve the environmental sustainability attributes of diets. Plant proteins are increasingly emphasized in food-based dietary guidelines. Protein nutrient content claims are one strategy for helping consumers identify plant protein foods. Labeling frameworks in Canada and the US consider both the quantity and quality of protein for permitting these types of claims on foods. Under the current labeling frameworks, particularly in Canada, the methods for assessing protein quality can disadvantage protein foods that are emphasized in dietary guidelines for making source of protein claims. And for individuals manufacturing foods, that complementarity aspect might have to be brought more so into your innovation pipeline to get where you want to be in terms of claiming protein. And regulatory modernization is required so that food labeling can support dietary guidelines and assist with consumers' awareness and adoption of dietary patterns with high levels of protein in foods. And with that, I'll hand things back to Janelle, and happy to entertain any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris, for the presentation. I just want to remind everybody that you can submit your questions below in the box. And just another reminder that we will be sending out a recording of the presentation to follow for those who registered. So the first question I have here, Chris, is does the PER ratio matter for protein quality if you're mixing proteins? For example, here is pea and rice protein.
The protein efficiency ratio, if you want to make a protein nutrient content claim in Canada, the method, the claim is underpinned by getting that protein rating. So you would have to have a PER value generated for that food.
Okay, great. Another one referencing the PER is just maybe if you can comment on, there was a study conducted showing that removing casein from rodents' diets reduced the rate of growth of cancer cells, and that returning casein into their diets turned on the growth of cancer cells, and this was done by a Campbell. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but if you have any comments.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with the study, but I would say that in the context of determining the PER of a food in the context of using the rat growth methodology proposed, it is only a 4-week study in weanling rats. So I'm not sure if the context of that study necessarily applies to this. I guess it would if they developed cancer in the midst of that study, but that would probably be something that safeguards. If you're conducting the study, you probably have more than 20 rats perhaps to safeguard against any animals that perhaps ran into health issues during the study. So that could be a methodological, something that's addressed methodologically when conducting the analysis, which would obviously be implemented by the laboratory conducting the work.
Great. Another question here is if cooking the pulses will have an effect or the processing on the PER or PDCAS values.
Yes, it can, and there's some recent work. I think that well, I know that Pulse Canada was involved in working with Jim House and Matt Noseworthy over the last few years, and I believe they've just published the last study of that group of studies last year. And if you send me an email after this, I can certainly send you the studies. But they evaluated the effects of processing of lentils, peas, chickpeas, and beans on PER and PDCAS values. And in some cases, the protein quality goes up, and in some cases, the protein quality goes down. They looked at things like baking and extrusion, traditional cooking, for example. And if you send me an email, I can certainly send that your way.
Perfect. And do you know if Health Canada has given a timeline for addressing protein regulations within Canada?
Yeah, so the last conversations that I've been a part of was perhaps, and you know, you have to understand that whenever you're dealing with government timelines, you have to be a little bit flexible. Was the fall, but I don't know what's going to happen now with the COVID pandemic. Things might be delayed a little bit, but I haven't had recent conversations. But it is on their agenda, and it has been publicly indicated that the protein labeling regulations do require some modernization.
Great, you got a lot of questions here. Another one is, would you be required to use the PER specifically for a particular bean? This is an example from a particular origin or supplier, or can you use it generally for that bean type?
I would say it would be very hard to enforce the former. So generally speaking, any, I guess, any bean type. I would say though, in your food formulation, I would probably do the legwork in case something has changed, at least preliminarily or at the beginning of your innovation cycle, that you have that evidence. If you're using really old data, it might not reflect the protein quality of today, and the protein quality may have gotten better. So that these are questions that you'd be assuming the risk as the innovator. But generally speaking, things could change. So you'd probably want to know where your beans are coming from in your supply chain, and when you're innovating, test that product.
Okay, and just your opinion here, do you, when considering the pros and cons for each method, do you have an opinion on either the PER or the PDCAS?
I think given the challenges that I highlighted in today's presentation, I think the PDCAS is a more accurate reflection of the protein quality of foods as they pertain to humans. It is based on indispensable amino acid recommendations in humans, albeit children 2 to 5, but that's a safeguard approach, and I somewhat agree with that. Um, the PER method, the amino acid requirements of the growing rat are going to be different for humans, particularly with sulfur amino acids. And it doesn't credit maintenance in any way. So I would obviously, excuse me, lean towards the PDCAS. And that's been acknowledged publicly by the FAO and WHO in 1991 when they came out with a report.
Great. So this kind of, I think, leads into this next question. I'm not quite sure which chart it was referring to, but do we have some information for comparative animals, such as cats, dogs, or any captive animals?
In terms of protein quality?
Yeah, I think, I don't know if I'm relaying the question quite properly, but do we know how that would potentially relate to
Well, yeah, well,
animal nutrition?
well, yes, well, in animal science, it's a bit of a different ball game. So when you're dealing with swine and chickens, for example, like you're manufacturing food, and you know generally the values, the digestibility values around some of these ingredients are fairly well known. So yeah, you can calculate the protein quality for a chicken using PER, for example, but yeah, it is going to be different than what you determine in a rat, because the amino acid requirements are going to be different, and that is actually used often within the animal sector.
Great. I will have one last question here. Would you recommend then conducting the PER or PDCAS analysis on cooked products rather than the raw pulse?
Well, yeah, you would probably want to conduct your analysis on how the food is going to be consumed. Raw pulses are going to have anti-nutritional factors like trypsin inhibitors and lectins that, when consumed raw, would make a human quite ill, possibly, and not reflect the true protein quality of the food or the ingredient, because it's not reflecting how the food would be consumed. So yes, I would probably conduct the assessment on subjecting the food to the cooking methods and processing methods on to which they would be consumed.
Great. Sorry, we got one last one here. If a protein is not a source of product, sorry, is not a source of protein, then the word protein cannot be used on the label. And given so, do you know if Health Canada is considering revising that rule in addition to revising the criteria for meeting a source of protein claim?
I'm not. The government has not been forthright in indicating where they are leaning in terms of modifying the regulation. But I agree that that is a challenge. But that criteria actually exists in the United States as well. A lot of people don't follow it, but generally speaking, if you look at some of the litigation in the States, claiming on the front of the pack that your food is a source of, or just putting the numerical value on the front of your pack in the United States can open you up to litigation if you're not meeting the threshold for a source of protein claim, because it is an implied claim in that sense. So that rule actually exists on both sides of the border. I think it's going to depend on where the government in Canada goes with regulatory modernization, if quality is still going to be a part of the equation. But I don't know if quality is going to be a part of the equation. I'm not sure if that would be removed. Any regulatory change in Canada is open for consultation, similar in the States. So stakeholders are free to provide the government with input at that time.
So on kind of a similar note then, if you're considering the quality of a protein in Canada and the US and for the regulations and in terms of being able to have a source of protein claim, are you aware if you could include something along the lines of contains a completed protein or contains a quality protein on labeling?
I want to answer that question. There are, I believe, in the CFIA's guideline for industry, there is a section, I believe, that does address that. I don't want to overstep in answering the question because I haven't looked at it in some time, but I believe that has been addressed. If whoever asks that question sends me an email, I can certainly point you to the exact page or provide you a link to that page within the CFIA's guidance that discusses that. But I believe that guidance has been provided.
All right, thank you, Chris. All right, I think I'm going to cut off the questions here. So on behalf of Pulse Canada, I'd like to thank everybody for joining. If you have any additional questions, please feel free to reach out to Chris or any of the staff at Pulse Canada. We have a variety of expertise, and you can find all of our contact information at the Pulse Canada website. So thanks everyone for joining.
Thank you.